Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to both industries and audiences for Late Night Women's Hour, a set radio programme for A-level media studies. If Late Night Women's Hour appears in the exam for Media Studies A-Level, it will only be in Section B of Component 1 as an Industries or Audiences question. If you are sitting the exam in 2020, you will specifically be focusing on an episode entitled Home. However, if you're sitting the exam in 2021 or later, your school will be able to choose an episode or episodes of their choice in order to illustrate different points. So in this video, I'm going to look at both Home and other episodes to illustrate my points. You just need to be aware of when you are sitting the exam and which episode or episodes you want to be referring to. The first thing you're going to need to know about Late Night Women's Hour is some information about the company that makes it and broadcasts it and the radio industry in general. Late Night Women's Hour is broadcast on BBC Radio 4. BBC has a huge number of radio stations and TV channels. It's a very established conglomerate of a TV company that operates both in TV, in film, in magazines, and operates not just in the UK but also abroad as well. So it's a very powerful company. The BBC is quite unusual in comparison to many other companies in the way that it's funded. The BBC is funded entirely through licence fees. Now, what that means is that the general public, including your parents and your friends and families, we all pay an annual licence fee, and that licence fee entitles us to watch TV in our own homes. I'm going to put the cost of a licence fee on the screen now so you can see how much this costs, and every household has to pay this amount each year to enable them to have access to TV within their homes. But that money goes towards the BBC only, not all TV channels, just the BBC. And that goes towards just their TV programmes and their radio programmes as well. And they use that money to make all their products. A lot of audiences don't enjoy paying the licence fee. There's a lot of debate about whether people still want to continue paying it. They feel a little bit resentful that they need to pay just to get access to one company's products, when there are so many other companies out there, for example, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Sky, offering them a huge number of channels for, a fraction of the price of the licence fee. What that means is the BBC have to try and please their audience as much as they can, whilst also fulfilling their public service broadcasting remit. Now, the BBC are a PSB broadcaster. That means that as a public service broadcaster, they have certain obligations that they have to fulfil. So these are things they have to do. On the screen now is a list of things that as a PSB broadcaster, the BBC have to do in the vast majority of their products in order to qualify for getting that licence fee funding. So what you're going to need to be able to do is to try and see whether you can see these things reflected in Late Night Women's Hour, whether that's in the episodes or their website or the way the audience consumes it. So, for example, diversity is one thing that the BBC has to offer as part of being a public service broadcaster. So have a think about Late Night Women's Hour. If you are studying Home as the episode, if you are sitting the exam in 2020, there is some diversity in that it does represent women far more than many other programmes. It's an all-female cast of presenters and guests, which does reflect some perhaps women that might be underrepresented in other media products, but it doesn't necessarily reflect men, and it doesn't necessarily reflect people from different ethnic backgrounds. The vast majority of the presenters are white middle class women. Although they are from a range of nationalities and backgrounds and they have different jobs, it is generally white middle class women that take part in the show and that present the show. So there is some diversity within the show, but perhaps there is an argument that they don't necessarily reflect that diversity across their episodes. If you are studying other episodes of Late Night Women's Hour, have a look at those, the guests and the presenters of those particular episodes, and see whether those episodes may be similar in terms of the representation and diversity. Another part of their public service broadcasting remit is that their programs and their content have to inform, educate, and entertain. So it means they can't just put on programs or broadcast radio content that is just entertaining, that is just silly, or that is just fun. It needs to have some kind of information or educational benefit for the audience. So have a look at the episode or episodes you are studying and try and work out what is there in those episodes that is informative or educational. In the episode entitled Home, there's quite a lot of informative and educational content. They use quite a lot of long jargon type words which are quite complex, seem to be educating the audiences. They talk a lot about cultural habits and hobbies, and they discuss other countries and their behaviours and backgrounds as well. So they are educating the audience on what people from different cultures might consider important with regards to the home. Other episodes that you may have listened to often offer a range of informative and educational content about things like women's health, women's rights, laws, entertainment, and politics as well. The benefits of being funded by a licence fee rather than being a commercial channel funded by advertisers is that they have no need to try and attract large numbers of audiences. If you're a commercial channel, you have to attract a large audience in order to guarantee that advertisers are going to want to spend money placing adverts on your channel. But if you are a licence fee funded radio station, there are no adverts, and therefore it doesn't matter whether there is one person listening or a million people listening to your radio station. And so that means that the BBC can afford to broadcast a lot more content that might be considered very niche and very alternative and could be considered to have a highly specialised audience. And they don't need to worry about attracting huge numbers of listeners. That might explain why some of the content for Late Night Women's Hour is potentially very, very niche indeed and might have a very limited appeal. It doesn't have music, there's no sound effects, there's no real kind of fun competitions or jingles. It is simply intellectual conversation. It's very plain, it's unadorned with kind of other sounds, and it is quite complex language used as well, which shows how niche and specialised it is. Late Night Women's Hour is a spin-off from another radio programme on BBC Radio 4 called Woman's Hour. Woman's Hour is a popular radio programme that has been running since the 1940s and is mainly targeted at women aged kind of 60 and over. And Woman's Hour is a broadcast earlier in the day. And what they felt was, as a channel and as a broadcaster, that they were finding that some younger audiences, and when I say younger, I mean maybe kind of 40 to 55, were finding it quite challenging to engage with some of the content in Woman's Hour because it was aimed at a slightly older audience, aged kind of 55 and over. And so they developed Late Night Women's Hour as a late night spin-off to be broadcast, obviously, in the evening after the watershed, to try and engage those slightly younger audiences aged kind of 40 to 55. And in order to do that, you have to think about what is there in the programmes that you've studied that is designed to attract those kind of audiences. So controversial content, adult topics. For example, in some episodes, they discuss things like self-lubricating vaginas. They discuss things like masturbation, abortion, miscarriages, upskirting. They talk about contraception. They talk about all sorts of quite adult content, which would perhaps engage that younger audience because of its shocking nature. The late time at which it is broadcast would be engaging for women who are a bit more independent, perhaps their children are slightly more grown up, and it makes them feel as though they're going to hear something a bit more adult if it is on quite late at night. The fact that Woman's Hour was a programme at all might suggest that a lot of other content on the radio at the time was seen as being more aimed at men. So they developed Woman's Hour as being a programme that was very much focused on a female audience. And the development and the spin-off of a Late Night Woman's Hour suggests that even now in a modern age, we are still seeing women as a separate niche audience of their own. We're still seeing them as people who need specialised, separate content, rather than people who could be engaged by programmes that appeal to both men and women. It might suggest that the BBC haven't quite embraced the idea of gender equality if they are still making programmes aimed at a specific gender. It might imply that they believe that only women are interested in these particular topics, as though they believe that men might not either care or be interested in topics such as contraception, women's politics, and women's rights. However, some women do really enjoy the idea of having a programme specifically aimed at them. They feel that it addresses their direct needs, and so there are definitely a female audience out there who enjoy having this content directly targeted towards them. The late night time slot at which it's broadcast, which is 11 p.m, might limit the number of audiences who do listen to it. Sometimes we often associate there being a prime time slot of around 7 to 10 p.m, when people are more likely to be listening to the radio or watching TV or films. 11 p.m, a lot of people do go to bed, particularly women if they've got children as well, so they may be more likely to be in bed at that time. So it might limit the audience in terms of the actual scheduling choices itself. However, scheduling is something that has changed a lot in the last few years, and in particular this is to do with technology. In the past, if a radio programme was broadcast at a certain time and you missed it, then you missed it and there were no other opportunities to listen to it, apart from if there was an omnibus maybe on a different day. However, with the advent of new technologies such as BBC Sounds, which is their website that allows you to play previous episodes, with the advent of things like podcasting and TV and radio on demand, plus DAB radio as well, it has allowed people to almost circumnavigate traditional scheduling. So now it doesn't matter if you miss an episode of your favourite radio programme, you can tune in and demand to watch that radio programme or listen to that radio programme whenever you want to. One issue about that is that it can be difficult to regulate. Ofcom is the regulator that regulates both radio and TV. And as I've previously talked about, we used to have this idea of a watershed at 9 p.m, after which more adult content could be broadcast. There's definitely adult content involved in other episodes of Late Night Woman's Hour. However, the home set episode for those sitting the exam in 2020 has a lot more kind of sanitised domestic content, but other episodes certainly have a lot more adult related content in them. So that late night slot makes sense. But if you can stream this episode at any time of day on any device, to a smartphone, to a tablet, and you can just access the programme on demand, then the watershed almost becomes pointless, and the regulation and the restriction of making sure that children don't get hold of a product like this, it becomes harder and harder. The choice of host for Late Night Woman's Hour is important, and it might vary depending on what episode you and your schools are studying, but it's useful to have a look at why that host might have been chosen and the appeal they might have to the target audience. For example, if you are sitting this exam in 2020, the host of the set episode Home is somebody called Lauren Laverne. Lauren Laverne is somebody who was well known for having a history of presenting and being involved and interested in quite alternative music. She was seen as somebody who was quite rebellious and sometimes quite controversial. She often spoke quite bluntly to people in TV programmes and on radio stations. And so perhaps that would have helped to communicate the slightly alternative or controversial nature of the show. And it also would have engaged female audiences who may have grown up listening to her on the radio or seeing her on TV when they were slightly younger. Being northern as well, having quite a strong regional accent, would have also helped to reflect the BBC's commitment to representing regional areas on their TV programmes and in their radio stations as well. And that's part of their public service broadcasting remit too. Lauren Laverne is also relatively young in comparison to the presenters of, for example, the kind of mother show Woman's Hour. And so her relative youth might be a good way of engaging slightly younger audiences into the show. Curran and Seaton's theory suggests that the media industries are all about a small number of companies dominating the market and there to simply earn profit and create themselves more power. And you have to understand or consider how Late Night Woman's Hour might reflect that theory or challenge that theory in some way. Now, the BBC is quite a dominating company, and they do kind of monopolise the market a little bit in terms of the number of radio stations they own and run. However, because they are not about profit at all, they don't earn money from commercials. Their money comes from us as the public licence fee payers. It absolutely challenges this idea that the media industry is all about profit. It's not about profit, this show. It's about providing something because of their public service broadcasting remit that is there to perhaps inform and to educate as well as entertain. Now, obviously, the audience of the original Woman's Hour and the audience of Late Night Woman's Hour are substantially different. And bearing in mind, Woman's Hour started in the 1940s, the women that started listening to that show back in the 1940s would be very different to the women listening to Late Night Woman's Hour now. So it's important to have a think about how different women and different audiences might respond. How might men respond to Late Night Woman's Hour? I've played several episodes of this show to my A-level students, and there is a marked difference in the way that young men respond to some of the content, particularly some of the more shocking personal content about women's health, in comparison to the way that female students respond. And so men might respond very differently. They may feel that the radio show is not aimed at them at all and that they can't access the content because of that. Some people from more working class backgrounds or with lower level education might feel that they can't access the content because it is too intellectual, it's too political, it's too complex in terms of the words and the phrases that they use. Some women might enjoy some of the more controversial content. You know, it is very entertaining for the most part. And a lot of women, particularly those who consider themselves maybe more feminist, might enjoy some of the more feminist style discussions that go on in many of the episodes. However, there probably still are some traditional female audiences, and in particular maybe those older traditional female audiences, who still prefer the old kind of Woman's Hour format, where it is perhaps slightly more domestic and the gender stereotypes are not challenged quite so much, where the content is perhaps more about things like gardening and cooking rather than politics and women's rights. Although the target audience for Late Night Woman's Hour is perhaps women aged 40 and over, they still use a considerable amount of digital technology to promote the show and to engage audiences. For example, Lauren Laverne, if you're studying the Home episode, is somebody who has quite a large Twitter following, and she regularly posts on her Twitter profile links to the show and her own comments and ideas about the show as well. And that helps to bring in listeners to her programme. BBC Radio 4 also has their own Facebook page and Twitter profile where they regularly post ideas and content from the show too. And there is also obviously a Late Night Woman's Hour page within the BBC website that allows listeners to do a whole range of things, such as explore content, read further information to get background ideas about the content on the show, to perhaps comment, like and share, engaging those audiences who want some interaction. And it also offers listeners the opportunity to catch up on previous episodes, to listen to podcasts and clips from the show too. It's worth having a think about some of the reasons why audiences listen to radio and enjoy radio programmes in general. It's an accessible medium. You can multitask whilst you're doing it. So a lot of people listen to the radio whilst they're in their cars or doing something else at home. It's portable due to the rise in technology. Because we can access radio now on our phones and tablets, we have the ability to listen to radio wherever we are and not just in the home. It allows us to be updated with things like news as well. And it's quite entertaining for those people who listen to programmes like Late Night Woman's Hour. They will listen to it for things like education, information and entertainment. In the Set Home episode, they talk about a range of topics that might be familiar and relatable to their target audience in order to engage them. So, for example, they talk about spending time with families and children, they talk about cosy nights in and watching films, and they refer to several other media products. These are intertextual references to other media products which might engage the target audience as well. So, for example, they refer to programmes like Bake Off, and they also refer to Nigella Lawson, who's a kind of famous British TV cook. So it's, referring to things that the audience might be familiar with. That was also engaging. And they also refer to hobbies and tasks like craft, which might be appealing to a female target audience as well. There is some use of humour within the episode as well. Several times the guests and the presenter joke with each other about content. At one point, Lauren Laverne, the host, says it's sort of inexplicable that you couldn't find these particular toys in a toy shop, and she's obviously saying it in quite a sarcastic manner. But it's the use of this humour that might engage an audience as well. There's even a reference to the fact that modern women aren't often domestic anymore in comparison to the past. They talk about domesticity, and Lauren Laverne, as the host, says, I'm really not very good at any of that domestic stuff. And she says something along the lines of, fail, and laughs. So kind of suggesting that she isn't a very successful domestic person. And this would be quite appealing to a younger target audience who perhaps might not want to be a domestic female. They might have aspirations to be somebody with a career or a life outside of the home. So if you get a late night woman's hour question, remember, for an industries or audiences question, it will be stepped with quite a lot of factual information needed. So it's worth making yourself some fact sheets or revision cards to help you with the information you're going to need for late night woman's hour.